Camp Serenity, Arizona, November 1945. The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the corrugated metal roofs of the temporary structures that dotted the compound like scattered dice across tan earth. Sergeant Evelyn Mitchell stood at the entrance gate, her hand shielding her eyes as she watched the convoy of military trucks wind their way up the dusty access road. The vehicles kicked up clouds of copper-colored dust that hung in the still air like a question mark. Inside those trucks were 42 Japanese women, the first female prisoners of war from the Pacific Theater to arrive at this facility, and Evelyn knew that everything they had been taught about Americans had prepared them for something far different from what they were about to experience. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The lead truck came to a halt with a mechanical groan, its brakes squealing in protest against the desert heat. Evelyn had processed hundreds of prisoners during her 18 months at Camp Serenity, mostly German and Italian men who had been captured in North Africa and Europe. But this was different. The war with Japan had been personal in a way that the European theater never quite achieved for most Americans. Pearl Harbor remained a fresh wound in the national consciousness, and the brutal Pacific Island campaigns had filled newspapers with stories of Japanese soldiers who would rather die than surrender. Yet here they were, women who had worn the uniform of the Imperial Japanese Army, now sitting in American trucks on American soil, about to discover that their propaganda had lied to them about almost everything. Colonel Raymond Bradford emerged from the administration building, his boots crunching on the gravel pathway as he approached. He was a tall man with silver hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent too many years in the sun. His uniform was impeccably pressed despite the heat, a testament to his belief that standards mattered even in the middle of nowhere. He carried a thick manila folder under his arm, and Evelyn recognized it as the briefing packet that had arrived 3 days earlier from Pacific Command. "The situation is delicate, Sergeant Mitchell," Bradford said without preamble as he stopped beside her. "These women were told that Americans would rape them, torture them, execute them. Most of them expected to die rather than be captured. Some attempted suicide when their units were overrun. The fact that they are here at all means they have already experienced a significant psychological shock. Our job is to show them that their government lied to them about who we are." Evelyn nodded, understanding the weight of what he was saying. She had read the intelligence reports about Japanese military culture, about the concept of honor that made surrender worse than death, about the propaganda that portrayed Americans as inhuman monsters. These women had been raised in a society that valued collective duty over individual survival, and their capture represented not just military defeat, but personal shame that ran bone deep. The truck's canvas covering was pulled back, and Evelyn got her first clear look at the prisoners. They sat in 2 rows facing each other, their hands unbound, their faces carrying expressions that mixed exhaustion with something harder to define. It was not quite fear and not quite defiance, but rather a kind of resigned alertness, like animals who had been cornered and were waiting to see what the predator would do next. Most wore the remnants of military uniforms, though the clothing was torn and stained from weeks of jungle warfare followed by the long journey from the Pacific to the American mainland. Their hair was cropped short in military fashion, and their faces were gaunt from inadequate rations during the final desperate months of the war. One woman in particular caught Evelyn's attention. She sat near the front of the truck, her posture unnaturally straight despite obvious fatigue. Her uniform bore the insignia of a communication specialist, and there was something in the way she surveyed the compound that suggested a sharp intelligence still functioning despite everything she had endured. Her eyes moved systematically across the compound, noting guard positions, fence heights, building layouts, the distance to the perimeter. Even as a prisoner in a foreign land, she was still gathering tactical information. "That one is Akiko Tanaka," Bradford said, following Evelyn's gaze. 26 years old, from Tokyo. Worked as a telephone operator before the war, then volunteered for the Women's Auxiliary Service Corps. She was captured in the Philippines while trying to evacuate communication equipment ahead of American forces. Refused to cooperate during initial interrogation. The intelligence officers say she is likely educated, possibly from a middle-class family. Her English is limited but functional. The guards began helping the women down from the trucks. Some needed assistance due to injuries or simple weakness from their ordeal. I noticed how they instinctively moved closer together as they assembled in the compound yard, forming a tight cluster, as if proximity to each other could provide protection against whatever horror awaited them. Their eyes darted nervously toward the guards, toward the buildings, toward the high fences topped with barbed wire. Everything they saw was being filtered through the lens of what they had been taught to expect. And Evelyn could see the confusion beginning to register as they noticed details that did not match their expectations. The guards were not pointing weapons at them. The buildings looked sturdy and well-maintained, rather than like torture chambers. There were gardens with vegetables growing in neat rows, a recreation area with sports equipment, and in the distance they could see male prisoners playing a game that looked like baseball, while guards watched with casual indifference rather than hostile vigilance. Nothing about the scene matched what their training had told them about American prison camps. Corporal Thomas Hartley stepped forward, a young man with red hair and freckles who looked more like a farm boy than a soldier. He had been studying Japanese during his deployment in the Pacific, and while his pronunciation was far from perfect, he had achieved a functional grasp of basic communication. He cleared his throat nervously and began speaking in careful, halting Japanese. "Welcome to Camp Serenity. You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated with respect and dignity. You will receive medical care, adequate food, and shelter. Violence against prisoners is forbidden. You have the right to correspond with your families through the International Red Cross." The Japanese women stared at him in collective disbelief. Several whispered urgently to each other.
Each other. Akiko Tanaka's expression remained carefully neutral, but Evelyn saw her hands clench briefly before relaxing again. The corporal's words were so completely opposite to what they had been conditioned to expect that they could not immediately process the information. It had to be a trick, a cruel joke before the real treatment began. Evelyn stepped forward, and Bradford handed her a clipboard with processing forms. She had done this dozens of times before, but never under circumstances quite like these. The German and Italian prisoners had at least come from cultures where the concept of humane treatment for captured soldiers was understood, even if not always practiced. These Japanese women came from a military tradition where surrender itself was considered the ultimate dishonor, where prisoners could expect nothing but contempt and cruelty. Convincing them that American standards were different would require more than words. "Ladies, I am Sergeant Evelyn Mitchell. I will be your primary liaison during your time here. Each of you will be interviewed individually for registration purposes. This is not an interrogation. We need only basic information for our records and to notify the International Red Cross of your status so that your families can be informed that you are alive and safe. After processing, you will be assigned to barracks, given medical examinations, and oriented to the camp procedures. Does anyone speak English well enough to serve as translator for the others?" There was a long silence. The women looked at each other uncertainly. Finally, Akiko Tanaka took a small step forward, her movements precise and controlled. She bowed slightly, a gesture so ingrained in her culture that it happened automatically despite her prisoner status. "I speak some English," she said, her accent heavy but her words clear. "I can help translate if needed." "Thank you, Miss Tanaka. Your assistance will be valuable." Evelyn gestured toward the administration building. "Please ask the others to wait here while we begin the registration process. You will be called one at a time." As Akiko translated this information to the other women, Evelyn observed their reactions carefully.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Fear was the dominant emotion, but underneath it she saw other things as well. confusion about the lack of immediate violence, uncertainty about how to behave in this strange situation, and in a few faces, particularly among the younger women, something that might have been the first fragile shoot of hope, though they would have been ashamed to acknowledge it. The administration building was cooler inside, with electric fans moving the air in lazy circles. Evelyn led the first prisoner, a young woman named Hana Yoshida, who had served as a military nurse, into a small office lined with filing cabinets and maps of the Pacific Theater. The room was spare but not threatening, with 2 chairs facing each other across a simple wooden desk. Hana sat down stiffly, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on some point on the wall behind Evelyn's head. "This will be brief," Evelyn said gently. "I need your full name, age, hometown in Japan, your military assignment, and where you were captured. I also need to know if you have family members who should be notified of your status. This information will be forwarded to the International Red Cross, which will ensure your family receives word that you are alive and safe." Hana's eyes widened slightly. She looked directly at Evelyn for the first time, searching the American woman's face for signs of deception. "You will tell my family I am alive?" she asked in halting English. "Not that I am dead. Not that I am being punished." Evelyn felt a pang of sympathy. These women had been taught that capture meant death, that their families would be told they had died honorably in service rather than face the shame of surrender. The idea that their families could know the truth and that they could correspond with them was completely outside their frame of reference. "Yes, we will tell them you are alive. We will tell them you are a prisoner of war being held in Arizona. Once you have been processed, you will be allowed to write letters home, 1 letter per week, reviewed by censors for security purposes, but your own words to your family." Hana's composure cracked for just a moment. Her eyes filled with tears that she blinked away furiously, ashamed to show such emotion in front of an enemy. "My mother," she whispered, "my mother thinks I am dead. I was captured in Okinawa. She would have been told that all women in my unit died in the battle." "We will send word to her," Evelyn promised. "The Red Cross is very efficient at locating family members, even in Japan's current situation." The interview continued with basic biographical information. Hana was 23 years old, from Yokohama, trained as a nurse in a civilian hospital before volunteering for military service. She had been assigned to a field hospital on Okinawa and was captured when American forces overran their position. She had expected immediate execution. Instead, American medics had treated her wounds, given her food and water, and transported her to a holding facility where she waited with other prisoners for weeks before being shipped to the mainland. "What happens to us now?" Hana asked as the interview concluded. "What is our purpose here?" "You will live here until arrangements can be made for repatriation to Japan. While you are here, you will have work assignments to keep you occupied and to contribute to the camp's operation. Laundry duty, kitchen work, gardening, things of that nature. You will have recreation time, access to a small library, and the opportunity to learn English if you wish." "The war is over, Ms. Yoshida. You are not being held here as punishment, but simply because international law requires a formal process for returning prisoners to their home countries." Hana stood slowly, still processing this information. At the door, she turned back. "Sergeant Mitchell, in Japan, we were told that Americans were demons, that you would do terrible things to prisoners, especially women. But you speak to me with kindness. You promised to tell my family I am alive. I do not understand why you do this." "Because it is who we are," Evelyn said simply. "Or at least, it is who we try to be." As the day wore on, Evelyn processed prisoner after prisoner, each interview following a similar pattern. Fear giving way to confusion, giving way to tentative, almost reluctant hope. By late afternoon, it was finally Akiko Tanaka's turn. She entered the office with the same controlled posture she had maintained since arriving, and she sat in the chair with her back straight and her hands folded precisely in her lap. Ms. Tanaka, thank you for your assistance with translation today. I know this has been a long and stressful process for everyone. It is my duty to help my fellow soldiers, Akiko replied formally. Even in captivity, we must maintain discipline and support each other. Evelyn made notes in her file,
Akiko's file, as they went through the standard questions. Akiko was 26, from Tokyo, had worked as a telephone operator at the Central Communications Exchange before the war. She had volunteered for military service in 1943 and received training in radio communications and encryption. She was captured in the Philippines while part of a rearguard unit trying to maintain contact with retreating Japanese forces. She had a mother and younger brother in Tokyo, though she did not know if they had survived the American firebombing of the city. When the factual questions were complete, Evelyn leaned back in her chair and studied the young woman across from her. There is something I want you to understand, Miss Tanaka. What you see here at Camp Serenity is not an exception or a special circumstance. This is how America treats prisoners of war. All prisoners, from all countries. The facilities you will see, the treatment you will receive. These are standard practices mandated by our military regulations and international law. Akiko's expression remained carefully neutral. "Why do you tell me this?" she asked. "Because I suspect you are someone the other women look to for guidance. What you believe about this place will influence what they believe. And I want you to understand that whatever you were told about American brutality, whatever you were taught to expect, it was propaganda designed to make you fight harder and surrender less readily. The truth is different." Akiko's jaw tightened slightly. "In Japan, we have a saying, 'The nail that sticks up gets hammered down.' Individuality is less important than group harmony. Honor matters more than personal survival. These are not propaganda, Sergeant Mitchell. These are the foundations of our culture." "I understand that," Evelyn said carefully. "And I am not asking you to abandon your culture or your values. I am only asking you to observe what happens here with open eyes. Judge us by our actions, not by what you were told about us." There was a long silence. Akiko stared at her folded hands, and when she finally looked up, there was something vulnerable in her expression that had not been there before. "We were told you would torture us for information, that you would starve us and work us to death, that we would be better off committing suicide than allowing ourselves to be captured. Some of the women in our unit chose that path. They killed themselves rather than surrender. And now I sit here in this office, being offered letters home and work assignments and access to a library. It does not make sense." "War rarely does," Evelyn said quietly. "Come, let me show you to your quarters. There is something I think you need to see." They left the administration building and walked across the compound in the fading afternoon light. The desert air was beginning to cool as the sun dropped toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Akiko walked beside Evelyn with the same precise military bearing, but her eyes moved constantly, taking in every detail of her surroundings. Other Japanese prisoners were being escorted to various parts of the camp, and Akiko could see that none of them appeared to be under harsh guard or immediate threat. The women's barracks was a long, low building constructed of adobe brick with a corrugated metal roof. It had proper windows with screens to keep out insects, and Evelyn could see electric lights already glowing inside as evening approached. They climbed 3 wooden steps to the entrance, and Evelyn pushed open the door. Inside, the barracks was divided into individual sleeping areas, each with a metal frame bed, a thin but clean mattress, sheets and blankets, a small locker for personal belongings, and a wooden chair. The space was basic, but clean and well-maintained, far better than the crowded group sleeping arrangements that had been standard in Japanese military facilities. But Akiko barely noticed any of this. Her attention was fixed on the door at the far end of the room, marked with symbols in English and in simple pictographs. "Through there," Evelyn said, watching Akiko's face carefully, "is the washroom facility."
Camps. Akiko moved to one of the sinks and turned the tap marked with a red indicator. After a moment, steam began rising as hot water flowed from the spout. She held her hand under the stream, feeling the heat against her skin, and something in her carefully maintained composure began to crack. In Japan, even before the war, hot water was a luxury. Public bathhouses were common, but private hot water in individual facilities was rare outside the homes of the wealthy. During her military service, she had washed in cold water from buckets or bathed in communal facilities when such opportunities existed at all. At home in Tokyo, Akiko said softly, her voice carrying an edge of something that might have been anger or shame or simply bewilderment. "My family shared an outhouse in the courtyard with 3 other families. We heated water in kettles on a charcoal stove for washing. My mother considered it a luxury when we could afford to visit the neighborhood bathhouse once a week. And here in a prison camp for enemies, you have hot running water and flush toilets in every building." Through the thin walls, they could hear other Japanese women discovering their own washroom facilities. There were gasps of surprise, urgent conversations in rapid Japanese, the repeated sound of toilets flushing as prisoners tested the mechanisms to confirm they were real. One woman began crying, her sobs echoing off the tile surfaces. Whether the tears came from relief or shame or overwhelming confusion, Evelyn could not tell. Akiko turned off the water and gripped the edge of the sink with both hands, her knuckles white with tension. "We were told so many things about America and Americans," she said, still staring down at the porcelain basin. "We were told that you were spiritually empty, that you valued material comfort over honor and duty, that your society was weak and decadent because you cared more about individual happiness than collective purpose. We were told that you treated prisoners worse than animals, that capture meant torture and death." She finally looked up at Evelyn, and there were tears standing in her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. "But these facilities are better than what Japanese civilians have in their homes, better than what our own soldiers had in their barracks. How is this possible? How can a nation we were taught to see as inferior provide such things even for its enemies?" Evelyn chose her words carefully, aware that she was navigating territory far more complex than simple prison camp administration. "Different cultures value different things, Miss Tanaka. In America, we believe that basic human dignity includes access to sanitation, adequate nutrition, shelter, medical care. These are not luxuries we extend as rewards for good behavior. They are baseline standards that we believe every person deserves, regardless of who they are or what they have done." Akiko shook her head slowly, still struggling to reconcile what she was experiencing with everything she had been taught. "In Japan, we value sacrifice. We value endurance. We value putting the needs of the group above personal comfort. A soldier who complains about hardship is weak. A warrior who expects comfort has lost the proper spirit. These are not just military values, Sergeant Mitchell. These are the foundations of how we understand the world." "And yet," Evelyn said gently, "here you are, a prisoner of war in an enemy country, standing in a washroom with hot running water and flush toilets. What does that tell you about the world you thought you understood?" Before Akiko could respond, another Japanese woman entered the washroom. It was Yuki Nakamura, a radio operator who had been captured alongside Akiko during the retreat from Manila. Yuki was younger, barely 22, with a round face that had not yet lost all its youthful softness, despite the hardships of war. She stopped when she saw Akiko, and the 2 women locked eyes for a long moment. "Akiko," Yuki said in Japanese, switching to her native language in a way that suggested she needed the comfort of familiar words. "Have you seen what they have given us? Have you seen the beds, the blankets, the toilets? This cannot be real. This must be some kind of trick before they show us what American captivity really means." Akiko responded in Japanese, but Evelyn caught enough of the words to understand the gist. Akiko was telling Yuki to observe carefully, to watch what the Americans did rather than what they said, to reserve judgment, but also to acknowledge what was right in front of them. It was the response of someone whose entire worldview was being challenged and who was trying to process the implications while maintaining some semblance of the discipline and control that had sustained her through the war. Yuki approached a shower stall and pulled back the curtain. The shower head was simple but functional, and there were hooks for towels and clothing. She turned the taps experimentally, and after a moment, water began flowing, growing warmer as the hot water pipe delivered its contents. She put her hand under the stream and then withdrew it quickly, as if the heat had burned her. In Manila, Yuki said quietly, still in Japanese, we sometimes went weeks without proper bathing. We washed in streams when we could find them or used cold water from wells. The officers had better facilities, but for us, cleanliness was something we managed as best we could. And now, as prisoners, we have private showers with hot water. She turned to look at Akiko, and there was something desperate in her expression. What does it mean, Akiko? What are we supposed to think about this? It means, Akiko said slowly, carefully, that perhaps we were not told the complete truth about our enemies. Evelyn quietly excused herself and left the two women to their conversation, understanding that they needed time to process their discoveries without an American presence hovering over them. As she walked back across the compound toward the administration building, she reflected on the enormous psychological burden these women were carrying. They had been raised in a culture that valued honor above life, collective duty above individual survival. They had volunteered for military service, believing deeply in their nation's cause and their emperor's divine right to rule. And then they had been captured, which itself was a shame so profound that many of their comrades had chosen death instead. Now they were discovering that the enemy they had been taught to hate and fear was treating them with the consideration and dignity that exceeded anything they had known in their own military service. It was not just a matter of flush toilets and hot showers, though those physical realities were certainly shocking enough. It was the larger question those facilities represented about values and priorities, about what a society owed to human beings even when those human beings were enemies. Colonel Bradford was
waiting in his office, reviewing reports from the day's processing. He looked up when Evelyn entered and gestured for her to sit. "How did it go, Sergeant?" "About as expected, sir. Shock, confusion, disbelief. Most of them are still waiting for the other shoe to drop, still expecting that the decent treatment is temporary and that the real prison camp experience will begin at any moment." Bradford nodded thoughtfully. "It is going to take time for them to understand that this is the reality. They have been conditioned to expect cruelty, and kindness confuses them more than brutality would." "What is your assessment of their leadership structure?" Evelyn described her interactions with Akiko Tanaka, her observations of how the other women deferred to her, despite the lack of any formal rank designation in the camp. "Tanaka is intelligent, disciplined, and deeply conflicted. She is trying to maintain order and morale among the other women while simultaneously processing the fact that everything she was taught about us appears to be false. I think she could be a valuable liaison if we can establish trust." The colonel made notes in his file. "The next few days will be critical. They need to see consistency in our treatment. They need to understand that the conditions they are experiencing are not special circumstances or temporary measures, but rather standard operating procedure for American prisoner of war facilities." Over the following days, the Japanese women began the slow process of adapting to their new reality. They were assigned to work details, simple tasks that kept them occupied without being punitive. Some worked in the camp laundry, washing and mending uniforms for both guards and prisoners. Others were assigned to kitchen duty, helping prepare the meals that they themselves would eat. A few with nursing training worked under supervision in the medical facility, providing care for sick or injured prisoners. The work itself was not particularly difficult, certainly less strenuous than the labor they had performed during their military service. But what struck them most was the attitude of the American guards who supervised them. There was no shouting, no arbitrary punishment, no atmosphere of constant threat. The guards gave instructions calmly, answered questions patiently, and treated the Japanese women with the same professional courtesy they showed to everyone else in the camp. Akiko found herself assigned to the laundry detail alongside Sergeant Mitchell, who seemed determined to engage the Japanese women in conversation, despite their initial resistance.
The laundry room was warm and humid, filled with the smell of soap and bleach, and the steady rhythm of washing machines created a kind of mechanical music that filled the silences. "Your English is quite good, Miss Tanaka," Evelyn observed, as they sorted clean uniforms for distribution. "Have you been studying from the books in the camp library?" "Reading helps the time pass," Akiko replied carefully, "and it is useful to understand the language of one's captors." "We prefer to think of ourselves as your temporary hosts rather than your captors," Evelyn said with a slight smile, "though I suppose the distinction is largely semantic when there are fences and guards involved." Despite herself, Akiko felt a small flicker of amusement at this acknowledgement. "In Japan, we are taught that words matter greatly. The correct form of address, the proper level of politeness, these things communicate respect and maintain social harmony. Your language seems more casual about such distinctions." "English has its own subtleties," Evelyn replied. "We just express them differently. But you are right that American culture tends to be more informal than Japanese culture. We value directness over elaborate courtesy, though we try not to confuse directness with rudeness." They worked in companionable silence for a while, the rhythmic tasks of folding and sorting, requiring attention, but not preventing conversation. Finally, Akiko spoke again, her voice quiet, but carrying an undertone of genuine curiosity, rather than mere politeness. "Sergeant Mitchell, may I ask you a question that might be considered improper?" "Of course. I cannot promise I will answer, but you are free to ask." "Why do you treat us so well? We were your enemies. We fought against your soldiers, your allies. Many American men died fighting Japanese forces. Yet here, you provide us with facilities and care that exceed what we had in our own military service. In Japan, enemy prisoners were not always treated with such consideration." Evelyn paused in her work, considering how to answer honestly without sounding preachy or self-righteous. "Because that is who we are, or perhaps more accurately, it is who we aspire to be. The Geneva Convention establishes minimum standards for treatment of prisoners of war, but America generally tries to exceed those minimums because we believe it reflects our values as a nation." "Values," Akiko repeated, as if testing the weight of the word. "In Japan, we also speak of values: duty, honor, loyalty, sacrifice. These are the pillars of our culture, but your values seem different. You speak of individual dignity, of rights that belong to all people regardless of their actions or allegiances." "Both sets of values can coexist," Evelyn suggested. "Duty and honor are important. Loyalty and sacrifice have their place, but so do compassion and recognition of shared humanity. The question is not whether one set of values is better than another, but rather what happens when different value systems come into contact with each other." Through the windows, they could see Japanese male prisoners playing a game that looked like a modified version of baseball in the recreation yard. American guards watched from the sidelines, occasionally joining in conversations or settling disputes with patient authority. It was a scene that would have been unimaginable in a Japanese military facility, where fraternization between guards and prisoners was strictly forbidden, and any sign of friendly interaction would have been seen as a breach of discipline. Akiko watched this scene for a long moment before speaking again. "In our training, we were told that Americans had no culture, no sense of honor or duty. We were told that you were motivated only by material comfort and individual pleasure, that you would collapse when faced with determined resistance because you lacked the spiritual strength that comes from devotion to something greater than oneself." "And what do you think now?" Evelyn asked gently. Akiko turned back to the laundry, her hands moving automatically through the familiar motions of folding. "I think our leaders told us what they needed us to believe, not necessarily what was true. I think propaganda works in many directions, and all nations tell stories about their enemies that make those enemies easier to fight and easier to hate.
"That is a remarkably perceptive observation," Evelyn said, "and it takes courage to acknowledge that what you were taught may not be the entire story."
Taught might have been incomplete or deliberately misleading. That evening, Akiko sat on her assigned bed in the barracks attempting to write her first letter home to her mother in Tokyo. The task was more difficult than she had anticipated. How could she explain her situation without revealing information that might be censored? How could she describe her treatment without making it sound as though she was praising her captors, which might be seen as disloyalty to Japan? And most difficult of all, how could she convey the truth of her experience without forcing her mother to confront the possibility that the government they had both trusted had lied to them about fundamental aspects of the war? She had just begun tentatively putting words on paper when Yuki approached and sat on the neighboring bed. The younger woman looked troubled, her usual tearful expression replaced by something more complicated. "What are you writing?" Yuki asked quietly. "I'm trying to tell my mother that I am alive and well without making it sound like I have betrayed everything we believed in by being captured rather than choosing death." Yuki nodded slowly. "Some of the other women are talking about something I find difficult to believe. They say that prisoners can apply to remain in America after the war ends, that there are immigration programs and work opportunities available for those who want to stay." Akiko looked up sharply. "That is absurd. Why would anyone choose to stay in enemy territory rather than return home to help rebuild Japan?" Yuki's expression was troubled. "But what is waiting for us in Japan, Akiko? Tokyo has been firebombed. Hiroshima and Nagasaki have been destroyed by atomic weapons. The emperor himself has surrendered and renounced his divinity. Our entire world has been overturned. And here, as prisoners, we have hot water and flush toilets and regular meals. Here, we are treated with more consideration than we received in our own military barracks." Akiko wanted to argue, wanted to defend their homeland and their culture against this implied criticism, but the words would not come because she could not deny the truth of what Yuki was saying. They had both experienced the reality of life in the Japanese military, the constant shortages, the inadequate facilities, the acceptance of hardship as a necessary part of warrior spirit. And now they were experiencing something entirely different, a standard of care and consideration that challenged everything they had been taught about their enemies. Before she could formulate a response, Corporal Hartley appeared in the doorway of the barracks with the evening mail distribution. His Japanese had improved noticeably over the past few days, suggesting that he was studying diligently to better communicate with the prisoners under his supervision. "Mail call," he announced in careful Japanese. "Several letters from home have arrived through the International Red Cross." There was an immediate stir of excitement mixed with apprehension among the women. For many of them, this would be the first word from their families since their capture, the first confirmation that their loved ones even knew they were alive. Hartley moved through the barracks, reading names from his list and distributing envelopes. "Tanaka, Akiko," he called, and Akiko rose to accept a thin envelope bearing her mother's familiar handwriting. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, aware that Yuki and several other women were watching her with expressions that mixed hope and dread. If Akiko's family had received word of her survival, then perhaps their own families would as well. If her mother's response was kind, then perhaps there was hope that they had not brought irredeemable shame upon their families by surviving capture. The letter was written in her mother's careful script on thin paper that felt fragile between Akiko's fingers. "My dearest daughter," it began, and Akiko felt her throat tighten. "The American authorities have informed us through the Red Cross that you are alive and being held as a prisoner of war in a place called Arizona. When your unit was reported lost in the Philippines, we were told that all members had died honorably in service to the Emperor. To learn that you survived has brought both joy and complicated feelings to my heart." Akiko read on, her eyes moving across the familiar characters as her mother described the situation in Tokyo. The city was slowly attempting to rebuild after the devastating firebombing. Food remained scarce, and many families had lost their homes. The surrender had been a profound shock to the entire nation, and people were struggling to understand what their lives would look like under American occupation. But underneath the description of hardship and uncertainty, her mother's message was clear. She was grateful that Akiko was alive, and she trusted that her daughter would endure whatever trials lay ahead with the same strength and dignity that had always characterized her nature. At the bottom of the letter, her mother had added a final paragraph that made Akiko's breath catch. "Your brother speaks often of joining you in America if such a thing becomes possible after the war. He says that Japan will take many years to recover and that opportunities may exist in other places for those willing to start new lives. I do not know if this is youthful foolishness or wisdom beyond his years, but I want you to know that whatever choices you must make, you have my love and my support. Survival is not shameful, my daughter. It is the first requirement for any future at all." Akiko read that paragraph 3 times, trying to absorb what her mother was really saying. Permission to consider a future that might not include returning to Japan. Acknowledgement that the world they had known was gone and that new choices would need to be made. And most importantly, the explicit statement that survival was not shameful, which directly contradicted everything the military had taught them about the dishonor of capture. Yuki leaned closer, trying to read Akiko's expression. "What does your mother say?" "She says," Akiko replied slowly, carefully, "that the old world is gone and that we must find our way in whatever world comes next." Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged in the daily life of Camp Serenity. The Japanese women rose at dawn, attended to their work assignments, took their meals in the mess hall, and spent their evenings in recreation or study. The routine was structured but not oppressive, providing enough occupation to prevent boredom while allowing adequate rest and personal time. And with each passing day, the consistency of their treatment began to erode the expectation that the other shoe would eventually drop. The food was particularly striking. 3 meals a day, every day, with portions that were adequate and nutritious even if the flavors were unfamiliar. There was meat regularly, vegetables from the camp gardens, bread that was fresh rather than stale, and even occasional treats like fruit or desserts. The contrast with the increasingly desperate rations they had received during the final days of the war in the Philippines was astonishing. The final months of the war were stark enough that several of the women visibly gained weight during their first month in the camp. Akiko found herself engaging more frequently in conversations with Evelyn and other American staff members. What began as brief exchanges about work assignments gradually evolved into longer discussions about culture, values, and the nature of the conflict that had brought them together as captor and captive. These conversations were not interrogations, and the Americans made no effort to extract military information or force ideological conversion. They were simply people trying to understand each other across a gulf of language, culture, and recent enmity. One afternoon in late November, as Akiko folded laundry alongside Evelyn, the conversation turned to the concept of honor that was so central to Japanese military culture. In Japan, Akiko explained, honor is not something you possess individually. It belongs to your family, your unit, your nation. When you act with honor, you add to the collective dignity of your group. When you act shamefully, you diminish everyone connected to you. This is why capture is so difficult for Japanese soldiers. It is not just personal failure, it is betrayal of everyone who trusted you to uphold their honor through your actions. Evelyn listened carefully, folding a stack of towels with practiced efficiency. In America, we also value honor, but we tend to think of it more individually. Your honor is something you maintain through your own choices and actions. You can gain or lose it based on how you treat others, whether you keep your word, whether you act with integrity, even when no one is watching. But what about collective responsibility? Akiko asked. In your military, does a soldier's failure reflect on their entire unit? To some degree, yes, Evelyn acknowledged. Unit cohesion and mutual responsibility are important in any military. But we do not generally extend that to the soldier's family or their entire community. If an American soldier behaves dishonorably, the consequences fall primarily on that individual rather than spreading outward to taint everyone they are connected to. Akiko considered this as she moved to the next basket of uniforms. It is a fundamental difference in how we understand the relationship between individual and group. In Japan, the group is primary, and the individual exists to serve it. In America, it seems the individual is primary, and groups form to serve individual needs and goals. That is a somewhat simplified version, but yes, essentially correct. Neither approach is inherently better or worse. There are simply different ways of organizing society and understanding human nature. But your approach seems to work, Akiko said quietly, gesturing around the laundry room and by extension the entire camp. You have built a system that treats even your enemies as individuals deserving of dignity and decent treatment. In Japan, we built a system that demanded total sacrifice from individuals for the collective good, and that system led us to defeat and devastation. Evelyn chose her words carefully. War brings out both the best and worst in cultures. I cannot speak to everything that happened during this conflict, but I can say that trying to maintain humanity, even in the midst of inhumanity, is important. It matters how we treat people, even enemies, because those choices reflect who we are as a society. That evening brought unexpected news that sent waves of shock and excited discussion through the entire camp. Colonel Bradford made an announcement in the mess hall during dinner, speaking slowly so that Corporal Hartley could translate his words into Japanese for the benefit of those prisoners whose English was still limited. I have information to share regarding the situation in Japan and opportunities that may be available to you after your eventual repatriation. The American government is establishing programs to assist with Japanese reconstruction. Additionally, there are immigration pathways being developed for foreign nationals who wish to remain in the United States after the war. Any prisoner of war who is interested in exploring these options should speak with the camp administration. This is entirely voluntary. No one will be pressured to make decisions about their future before they are ready. The mess hall erupted in urgent conversations as the Japanese women discussed this announcement among themselves. Some dismissed it immediately as propaganda or a trick. Others, particularly the younger women who had seen their homeland devastated and their future prospects dimmed, listened with barely concealed interest. Akiko sat quietly, processing the implications while observing the reactions around her. After dinner, a small group gathered in the barracks to discuss what they had heard. Yuki was among the most vocal, her usual cheerfulness replaced by serious contemplation. "What is waiting for us in Japan?" she asked the assembled women. Bombed cities, occupied territory, years of reconstruction under foreign control, and the shame of being women who were captured rather than dying honorably? Here we could have opportunities, education, work, lives that are not defined entirely by what we endured during the war. An older woman named Hana Yoshida, who had served as a military nurse, shook her head firmly. Japan is our home. Our families are there. Our culture, our language, everything that makes us who we are exists in Japan. To abandon that for American comfort would be the ultimate betrayal of everything our country sacrificed during the war. "But what did we sacrifice for?" another woman asked quietly. "We were told we were fighting to defend our divine emperor and our sacred homeland. Now the emperor has renounced his divinity, and our homeland lies in ruins. Were those sacrifices meaningful, or were we simply used by leaders who did not care about our actual well-being?" The conversation continued late into the night, with no clear resolution. Akiko listened more than she spoke, understanding that each woman would need to make her own decision about the future based on her own circumstances and values. But she also understood that this decision was complicated by more than just practical considerations about where they would live or what opportunities might be available. At stake was the question of identity itself. If they chose to remain in America, would they still be Japanese? Would they be betraying their culture and their ancestors by choosing a different path? Or would they be exercising the very individual agency that American culture valued, making choices based on their own assessment of what would create the best possible future?